Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from Capital One Bank and Chase Commercial Term Lending, the Witkoff Group, New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Greenberg Traurig, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley & Lardner, Friedman, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investment Developers, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, N.A., Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Newbanks, MHP Real Estate Services, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rosewood Realty Group, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling Risk, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Continuum Company, the CUNY TV Foundation, the Moynihan Group, and these friends.
The Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn College, Peekskill. I want to go to Vista. Nah, I don't know. Maybe I'll be a political scientist. Nah, maybe I'll Delhi. Not a deli. The king of New York delis. I have Ronnie Dragoon, who is the principal, founder, cohort, man who makes sandwiches at Ben's Kosher Deli restaurants. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So tell me a little bit about your parents and your grandparents, where they came from, and a little history.
My grandparents were born in Russia. They hopped a freighter.
Okay, this is Dad's?
My paternal side, yes. Hopped a freighter in Hamburg, Germany. Came to America in 1910. Their name was Heschel and Rachel Dragunsky.
And they ended up in the Bronx, right?
In the Bronx, yes.
Right. And what did Grandpa do?
They were a family of hard-working tailors in Russia. They went into the dry cleaning business here.
That's on your dad's side.
That's
okay.
on my father's side.
Now tell me about Mom's side.
Their history goes back a lot further. They
were here like in the 1850s.
Right, right.
I didn't realize they came at this time. Yeah, so.
And they had a soda washer business in Jamaica, Queens, called Dr. Brenton's.
Not Dr. Brown's.
Not Dr. Brown's.
And?
They worked that until probably the 1950s. My grandfather branched off and owned a series of candy stores in the Bronx.
Candy stores, luncheonettes,
right,
with
in the
everything
Bronx.
over there. So tell me about your dad, a little bit about your dad before we became the Ben of Bens. But okay, yeah. Your dad worked in the laundry, in the dry cleaning stores, right?
Right. He was a route man when he first got married. In fact, there's a picture of my dad with his truck with his name on it, B. Dragoon. And he was a route man for quite a number of years. He met my mother. My mom was working in a bakery. My mom had to work because she had a sister who was born with a mother who passed away a month or two later, and a younger sister also.
So how did Mom and Dad meet?
She was in the bakery. My father dropped off something in a dry cleaning store not far away, chose to go into the bakery.
So
met.
This was after the war or during the war?
This was after the war.
Now, your father was in the military, I think?
He was in the Navy. He had two brothers who perished in World War II. They pulled my father out of the Navy. My aunt petitioned a federal judge, and this was, of course, after the Sullivans. So the sensitivity was heightened, and they got my father out.
So that's right. Your father came out in like 44.
Right.
Over there, and then he came back, and then he went into the in the delivery of the dry cleaning.
Right.
So, tell me about your youth.
All I can remember is what my mom told me, because I spent the first 3 years of my life in the Bronx. And she said, if I got a little dirt on my pair of pants, I would start screaming. The only problem with that was we lived in a 5-floor walk-up. So she had to schlep me up and down the steps.
So you leave there and you move to Queens, correct?
Yes, we moved to Glen Oaks, Queens, in a garden apartment.
Right, and at that time, Dad was in between jobs, right?
Right. He was in dry cleaning, did some other stuff, was a dry cleaning salesman, selling chemicals and hangers and other assorted sundries that dry cleaners would use.
And then what happened? One day, he got a union card to cut deli?
Yeah, that was afterwards. What happened was my uncle had a roadside rest, like a Nathan's, from Oceanside, but this was in New Jersey. My father was working there, but we lived at that point in Plainview because we moved to a house, 15990. That lasted about 3 years until the bank foreclosed.
What was Dad doing? Working for your uncle at this time?
Before that, then he was selling used cars.
Where was that?
That was also in Jersey.
So he was in New Jersey, and you were what, about 14 at this time, 13?
No, I was much younger. I was probably 9 years old.
And you had this rude awakening one day that it foreclosed on you. So you had to move because you had no home.
Right.
And at this time, you end up in Peaks.
Back to Glen Oaks. We started in the Bronx, went to Glen Oaks. My parents bought a house, didn't work out, moved back to Glen Oaks, Queens. And I think about 3 or 4 years later, we were evicted. My father chose not to pay the rent, for whatever the reasons were. And we had to move to Peekskill, upstate New York, where a distant cousin had a bungalow colony, and he had some empty bungalows. And so we stayed there from probably the mid-month of July to the middle or end of October. The only problem is in the mountains, there's no heat in bungalows, and it gets colder up there. So to this day, I keep the heat at 72, 73 degrees in the winter.
I know that because things were tough growing up, you had an assortment of jobs. Tell me about some of the jobs you had.
Well, I delivered newspapers. I sold greeting cards. I collected coins, made money collecting coins.
And trading them.
Trading them.
Okay, so it was dry cleaning, chemicals, used cars, roadside rest, and one day he gets a union card to work in the
delicatessen deal. That's right.
So how'd that happen? Did he have a friend or a relative?
Yes. He was. My uncle was. He had a card that was number 6 in the union, but he was in New Jersey. But his good friend was a fellow named Joe Decker, who was the president of the union.
So Dad gets a job,
right.
And is this the job that he gets on 72nd Street?
No, this is a job that he floats around. He worked in Lou G. Siegel, that's now Ben's. He worked in the Bronx and delis, and he floated around actually learning the trade because it's a little different than a roadside rest. And then he worked for a deli in the Bronx called Skyview, and that was about a 6-year tenure. At this point, he started managing a store on 72nd Street.
Right, on the west side.
On the west side.
And what was that store called?
72nd Street Deli.
And at that time, are you in high school? Or
college.
You're in college, okay. You graduated, what, Francis Lewis High School?
No, actually Forest Hills High School.
Forest Hills High School. And then you go to Brooklyn College.
Right.
And at Brooklyn College, how did you decide you wanted to be a political science major?
I was always politically active. I come from the progressive wing, and it was just something that I was attuned to. Even in high school, I took advanced courses in democracy and problems of American democracy. And so it's just a natural extension. And the reason why I went to Brooklyn College was because all the refugees from the Johnson administration, leaving the administration over Vietnam, they went to Brooklyn College.
So you went to Brooklyn College, Were you working with your dad on 72nd Street? at
Yes,
this
I was.
time?
Yes.
So how do you become a deli man yourself? How do you become a...
Because I was smart enough to understand that I don't have the answers and that I gleaned all this stuff from the people I worked around. And what I chose to do was pick the best practice from all the people that I watched working. And the first sandwich I ever made, the customer came back to the counter.
Did you cut these yourself?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay.
But I'm one of the best. I know how to work with a piece of meat. And pretty much everyone that's come through the Ben's University course has gone through people either I've trained or the people that I've trained.
We have to first get to the story of how Ben's became Ben's. So you're working with Dad,
Right.
okay, at this time, and Dad's on 72nd Street working.
Right. He was managing the store before that. Then it went broke, and he took it over.
Okay, he takes over the store. You graduate Brooklyn College with political science, and how did you decide to go to Vista?
Again, I was always inclined to do something that was progressive, and I thought Vista and the Peace Corps were progressive. I was afraid to go out of the country, so I wound up in Indiana because Peace Corps was international, Vista was domestic.
So what you do for 2 years?
Actually, it was a 13-and-a-half-month tour. I educated people on what they were entitled to, what they were not entitled to. I started a credit union. I had to go up to Bloomington, Indiana, to the law school to study. I also started a co-op, a black store co-op. The only problem is nobody came into the bookstore, so I was the most well-read person in Richmond, Indiana on black history.
So it's 13 months later, and you come back to New York City.
Right.
You could teach. You could try to figure out what you do with a political science degree or go for a master's. And what do you do?
It was opportunistic. At the same time I came home, a kosher deli went out of business on the South Shore of Long Island in Baldwin, which turned out to be the first Ben's.
So how did you find this? I mean, was it the New York Times? Was it Daily News?
No, it was actually someone who worked for Hod Carmel Kosher Provisions, which was absorbed into Hebrew National years later. And he knew my dad, and he knew I had just gotten back from Vista. And he asked my dad, what is your son's plans?
Now, where are your parents living? Because I know you...
Regal Park.
So they're in Regal Park. Your dad at this time is he's owning the 72nd Street Kosher Deli. There's this opportunity in Baldwin for this 60-seater at that time, a small place that didn't do well. And you said to me it was, what, $30,000 was the purchase price for the place?
It was $5,000 down and $25,000 in promissory notes.
So where'd you get the $5,000?
My father was able to scrape it up.
Okay, so you have $5,000. You find this place over here, and then you learned, as you said to me, as we can tell, that your dad was not always the best businessman.
Right.
And he sometimes failed to pay the vendors on time.
Yes.
So Ronnie, who's 25 at this time, what happens with the vendors and the bookkeeping system?
When it all came to the fore, when people started calling me, I called my dad. I said, Dad, I gave you all the money. My father was a typical answer, I'll take care of it. At that point, I called up all the vendors. I asked them what I owed. I then called up my landlord, where there was a rent increase due in 2 months. I called the vendors, told them what the situation was. I was taking over the store. In the interim, I got a quitclaim deed from my dad to give up any right, title, and interest to the store. And we agreed on a payout system. I called up the landlord, and he knew I was hardworking. He saw me in the morning. His wife had Rahmanis on me, which is pity, because she saw me at 8 o'clock in the morning and she saw me at 9 o'clock at night. And any time she came into the restaurant, I was there. So he said yes. And here's the interesting part. He was known as somewhat of a hard-nosed landlord. I said, Mr. Udell, I need this to be delayed, the rent increase to be delayed. But when I can afford it, I'll call you up. And he agreed to that. And I think it was about 8, 9 months later, I called him up. I said, Mr. Udell, I now can afford to pay the rent increase.
I think it was maybe a year that you were working. You're working close to 100 hours a week, and you put an ad in the newspaper for a waitress.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about the ad in the newspaper and the waitress who subsequently became your wife.
Right. Two people came in for the interview, both of whom I hired. I asked the one what her phone number was, because I really didn't want to hire her. She was too fast for a family restaurant. She had a leather jacket on. She had keys flowing out of her pocket. And I said, this is a family restaurant. So I asked her, what's your phone number? With the intention of not hiring her. She said, I don't have a phone number. I had no stock reply. I said, start Saturday.
And?
She started Saturday.
And then what
and
happened?
About 6 months later, we were married.
So the first store was 1972.
Right.
And, you know, Ben's is your father's name, so that's how the thing. So how does Ben's, you know, with deli, as we said on the show, you know, at one time there were 1,500 kosher delis, and even when you opened up in 72, there were still kosher delis opening, and it was something. But 10 years later, 82, when you opened up Greenvale, the world was decreasing, okay? People were getting a little health conscious. They wouldn't want a little delicacy over here of a little pastrami, corned beef. They said, no, give me turkey. Or they became a vegan, you know, or just a pickle. But so how did you decide to expand in 82?
It was a very fertile area. It was the North Shore of Long Island. And there were many more kosher delis on the South Shore than the North Shore. But I'm not a genius. I just simply went by my gut telling me, why am I delivering all this catering to the North Shore? Why are they coming to this smaller deli on the South Shore of Long Island? They came for better food. Evidently, they were very satisfied with the service. And word spread. But that told me that there's a territory out there that should be very fertile.
So how does a guy like Frank Costanza,
Right.
one of the leading operators, the Miracle Mile, you know, make a decision? You know, I realize the Jews and Italians are very close. How do you make a decision on taking care of this kid who at this time, you're 35 over here.
33, I think.
33. He says, I'm going to let you open up and a much bigger deli restaurant than you had before, right?
Well, I was lucky. He came to the restaurant in Baldwin on someone's advice to say, you need him as a tenant. And a gentleman comes in, he sits down, I didn't notice him, I'm working behind the deli counter, and the cashier comes over to me and says, this man wants to buy the menu. I said, I think I should see him. First thing I said was, you don't have to buy the menu, you can have the menu. He then introduces himself as Frank Castagna, the owner of the Americana Shopping Center, and a center that he built in Roslyn, Greenvale, called Wheatley Plaza. He said, I think I'd like you as a tenant. Why was I lucky? I don't think I just finished building the store rebuilding the store a year before, and I expanded. And it was beautiful. And it was something that deli owners didn't do. They didn't hire designers. They didn't make the menu match the design or the decor. And it wasn't Formica. It was different. So he was intrigued by it. I guess he appreciated the design and the layout. And so he became very serious with me, and we had further discussions.
So, but here you opened up a much larger place. You really opened up a true restaurant, as one would say.
I knew that the future of my business was not the delicatessen counter. The delicatessen counter, though it's easy in and out, the margins are much less. The margins are much greater in the restaurant than they are in the delicatessen. And my goal was to be a restaurant.
So let's talk a little bit, because later on you open up a couple more, but there are certain times that are interesting in your life. As you said to me before, your dad had worked once for Lou G. Siegel's.
Right.
Lou G. Siegel's was the legendary restaurant at we would call the Garment Center.
Right.
Over here, you know, it was this facility. It was a 70-year-old location with 70-year-old pipes, as we've said. But Lou G. Siegel's had a reputation. And one day, this kid over here, who at this time was opened up, he had about 4 or 5 locations, plus the deli expresses, which we'll talk about in the middle, you have the opportunity to Lou G. Siegel's. Was that you coming out to come to Manhattan?
Yes, it was. I said, no matter what I do on Long Island, no matter what I do in Queens County, I will never get the recognition that I believe the brand deserves. And so when the landlord came to me, or a broker came to me, and said, the man hasn't put a nickel into the restaurant in 25 years, and we see you have a track record of investing money into the operation, we like you.
But the walls had, those were places where Al Jolson came out of. Those were the windows where, Mickey Katz. These were people who came over there, and the characters over from the Garment Center, and let's say the members of organized business and crime were over there. Lou G. Siegel's was the place.
It was the place. It was the epitome of the upper middle and upper classes, whether they were celebrities, comedians. I mean, George Burns met there. All the stars came out. In fact, I think that Eddie Cantor, if this is true, had a radio show that emanated from Lou G. Siegel.
You decided to be a little more creative, and how do you create the Deli Express?
The Deli Express was born out of the need to operate with a lot less labor. So as opposed to having 200 recipes that one had to follow, this required only 26. I sat down, I'm not ashamed to say this, I was able to get my hands on certain other manuals, and I read them, and I tailored the Ben's Deli Express after some of these national chains. It took me about 2-3 months to organize it, to put it onto paper, and then to start training people. It was easy enough to train people. I just brought them to the delis existing, the restaurants, and taught them these 26 recipes and taught them how to slice meat.
Now, what was interesting is that you were in Roosevelt Field, you were in Kings Plaza. I mean, you were in some of the best shopping centers in the New York City area,
Yes.
in the suburban area. And what happened to Deli Express later on?
As soon as the leases expired, the rents went up 200%, 300%.
And you can't make that back in francs and beans.
Right, it wasn't viable. If it was flour and water, whether it was pizza, pretzels, it's different.
So what happens now? You went to Mecca? You decided, I'm going to Boca Raton? What happened there? How'd that
For
happen?
years, people asked me to go to Boca Raton. But again, I'm not a genius. What happened was...
You ship pickles through the mail? I mean, how do we do this?
Well, there are pickle people down in Florida, but then I supplement it with pickles from up north. Every January, February, my business got worse and worse up north. I say they're going to someplace. Either they're going to South Florida or they're going to Arizona. I felt intuitively that it was to South Florida, and I delayed it. People wanted me there 10 and 12, 15 years before this. So I opened this restaurant in Boca Raton 10 years ago.
Now, this was not, the kids of the baby boomers remember his delis with, a counter and maybe 14 seats and a Dr. Brown's. They don't think of a restaurant that has 200 seats, right?
No. In fact, Boca Raton has 250 seats.
200, how big is it? What is it, a double-decker?
7,000 square feet. 7,000 square feet. It's expansive, it's open, it's airy, and it's state-of-the-art.
And it's kosher.
And it's kosher.
And it's kosher. And do you send the meat? The delicacies come down, or is
Well, I get direct deliveries from the Midwest for the kosher meat. It goes into a distributor down in Florida, Cheney Brothers, who's my broadline distributor. They bring it in, and I still pickle my own corned beefs and tongues in Ben's in Boca Raton. And I dare say that it's the only restaurant delicatessen that cures their own corned beef and tongues.
So now we're at a time where literally I don't think you can find 15 kosher delis in New York City, in the 5 boroughs. And even if I go to New Jersey, and I omit you out of the picture, there might be 15. Scarsdale? I mean, how Scarsdale? I mean, I realize, I understand the Florida, because when they have to go to Star and David over there, in Boca Raton, they for the Shiva package, they have to go to Ben's too. But how at this time in your life, certain people say, hey, I got a business. You're 63 or 64 years of age. And
66.
No, that I know. But
then?
How did you decide to go to Scarsdale?
In a lot of ways, it was similar to Boca Raton. When people started asking me to go to Boca Raton, I lost a lot of second-generation Long Islanders to Westchester County. And out of loyalty, they used to come back as many times as they could, even for takeout. They used to go to the Bayside Benz. And they were pleading with us to open up in Westchester. The president of my company is a New Rochelle person. He knew the area. So I said, go look. But it was the same. It was a demand that you get phone calls, I have comment cards, why don't you open up in Westchester? Why don't you open up?
Yeah, but people today, they hear a Zuma, they hear of a sushi place, they say, a deli restaurant is opening? I mean, it's an unusual thing. And you opened up this January, and how many seats is Scarsdale?
Oh, about 200.
So, from this little place in Baldwin, what is Ben's today? How big is the operation? How many stores? How many employees?
We have 7 stores, close to, if not 400 employees. We'll probably do this year about $26 to $27 million in gross revenues.
Right, and a portion of it is catering.
Right. I'd say about 10-12% of it is catering. I mean, that's an avenue for growth.
Right.
Certainly. But again, I knew years ago that the growth of my business would be in the restaurant, not in the traditional delicatessen. I mean, you could see it with the way the product breaks. I'm not selling nearly as many hot dogs as I used to.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the family. So you met this woman a number of years ago, and she didn't have the phone number, but she's been with you, and she's been your partner in business and your partner in your life, and your wife's name is?
Cindy.
Cindy. And you have?
2 children.
Okay, so let's talk about the loves of your life, because I know your daughter recently had a baby
right.
in December, I believe.
Right.
Your daughter's name is?
Jamie.
Jamie, and her husband's name is?
Is Lonnie.
And your little grandchild?
Is Ella Betty.
Right.
Betty named after my aunt.
Right, and then you have a son who I believe is a school teacher?
No, he's an assistant principal.
Assistant principal.
But he was the head of that dastardly thing called the core curriculum for the New York City school system until about a year and a half ago when he requested a transfer. It was a lateral move. Right, he went to Vassar. He was a New York City fellow. And New York City was good enough to let him get a master's degree on the city of New York.
So, Deli is alive, which is definitely represented by the fact that you have 7 locations, and that the 2 newest locations, Boca Raton and Scarsdale, are growing, and people are going over there because people, as they would say, manja, essa, okay? And there's no finer deli than Ben's, and I'd like to thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.